Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to arrive. This is the third webinar in the webinar series, Disability and Health Inequalities in Times of COVID-19. And we see the attendees arriving. It always takes a few minutes. So we're just waiting for everyone to arrive here now. I think let's give it another, I don't know, 30 seconds or something till the number's stable. Yeah, okay, let's start. All right, so hi everyone. So this is the third webinar in the webinar series that we're organizing with the Disability Study Group of the British Sociological Association. And the webinar series is called Disability and Health Inequalities in Times of COVID-19. This is the third one, and this is the first of a part 2 on intersectional inequalities. So this third week and the fifth week will both be on intersectional inequalities. So I'm one of the co-conveners of the British Sociological Association's Disability Study Group, and Sarah, that you should see on the top waving her hand now, is the other co-convener. So from our side on Zoom, just so you know, we cannot actually see you, but we are very pleased to observe that you all stayed in today to attend this webinar, even though it might be very rainy on your side as well. I'm not really sure about this. Let me just... we have gotten a lot better at managing Zoom, I think, over the last few weeks. However, I really would like to thank you in advance for your understanding and patience where it comes to all the technological glitches and human errors that might take place during this webinar. We all do our best. So just a little bit about how we try to organize this. We will input the transcript of the slides in the chat box. And even though in this week specifically, we don't have live transcripts, but the transcripts are of the slides for those for whom it is easier to follow the slides in the chat box. Last week, we heard that it might be slightly annoying if there are pop-ups from the chat box over your screen. So if that is something that you want to avoid, then you can do the following. Click on the chat so that it appears as a small pop-out screen. And when that happens, you can make it smaller, you can make it larger, and you can also move it to somewhere else on the screen so it doesn't bother you, basically. So in this way, it shouldn't pop up over the slides if someone is presenting. Yeah, just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available in a few weeks on the YouTube channel of the BSA. The BSA is partially still furloughed, so this takes a little bit of time. We have 4 presentations today, so it's really it will be really interesting and full webinar today. And how we will do it is that we will run all the presentations after each other. So there will be no time in between, apart from basically swapping between the people and sharing screen and these kind of technological things. So if you have a question to one of the presenters, what we would like you to do is to use the Q&A box at the bottom, so not the chat, but the Q&A box at the bottom, and put all your questions for the presenters there while everyone is presenting. So you don't have to wait, you can already put your question there, you can leave it there. Unfortunately, because Sarah and I are managing sort of the technological part of this, or the logistical part together, we won't probably be able to respond to questions during the presentations. So what we will do is with the 4 presentations, or after the 4 presentations, that is when we will start to take questions from you, in the sense that I will go through all the questions and we will pick a few of these questions to ask the presenters, and we have some questions ourselves as well. So the presentations that you will listen to today are from first Kene Onukwube, And his presentation is called Psychosocial Risk Factors and the Determinants of Health Inequalities Among Young People Living with Disabilities in Africa. The second person presenting is Monique Botha. And Monique's presentation is called What About Us? Concerns that COVID-19 will widen the mental and physical health disparities experienced by autistic individuals. The third presenter is Myrle Blaine. And Myrle's presentation is called Racial Inequalities in the UK and Experiences of Some Persons with Sickle Cell Disorder. Last, Rumana Hashem will present, and Rumana's presentation is called Disability, Gender and Migration, Theorizing COVID-19 Health Inequalities and Disability from a Gendered and Migration Perspective. So the first person presenter is Kene, who will probably, we all will stop our video and mute ourselves. And then Kene will, I think you will also stop your video, right? So that the connection is better. Myrle, will you, Myrle, yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent, thanks. So we just wait for everyone to be able to do so, and then I will also stop my video and mute myself. And just a second, where's Kene? Oh, there you are. Excellent. So Kene, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, I would do that right away.
Excellent. So if you want to start your presentation now, then.
Okay. Is my screen visible now, please?
Yes, it is. The presentation is fine so far.
Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon or good day, everyone, whichever part of the world you are listening in from. I am Kene Onukwube. I'm an independent researcher on social inclusion and adaptive social protection. My presentation contributing to this series of webinars is on psychosocial risk factors and the determinants of health inequalities among young people living with disabilities in Africa. To take us through, I'll do a bit of introduction, and then I would also do a brief on the livelihood context of young persons with disabilities, and then the determinants of health inequalities and what accounts for them. Finally, I would also speak briefly on the psychosocial risk factors and health inequalities before I give a conclusion. So I'll quickly move on to the introduction. Just to let you know that my email address is again at the bottom of this presentation, and you could reach out to me with your questions by email, so I can be able to do a bilateral communication with you by email. Yes, we all are aware that globally stereotypes and prejudice and stigma contribute to the discrimination that people with disabilities and their families actually experience. And of course, from the research and policy point of view, numerous data exists to buttress informed or evidence-informed policy making that are taken up by authorities or aid organizations who are within the sector of disabilities and health inequalities. However, the nexus of disability-focused health inequalities is actually scanty, except for recent times where we are beginning to see emergence of this, and specifically more recently due to the impact of COVID-19. So back in Nigeria here, where we are, the nexus have also gained some attention as it become very apparent the context within young people living with disabilities live and operate. And so it becomes more interesting and has become an issue for authorities. However, the country still struggles to maintain quality data to inform a policy direction for the well-being of these same young people. And so often what you find is that inequalities are manifest around health outcomes most of the time, but also significant among these youth living with disabilities that are engaged in some form of income-generating activities in Nigeria. So these same conditions are further exacerbated due to the current issues around the pandemic. Talking about data, we know that the World Bank, from available information, have shared that 15% of the world's population experience some form of disabilities. But then the prevalence is more with the developing countries. In Nigeria particularly, the World Report on Disability published in 2011, which is the most recent on Nigeria, has estimated that 25 million Nigerians had at least a form of disability, while 3.6 million of these have significant difficulties in functioning. The National Population Commission in Nigeria, with its latest, data in 2006, did mention that at the rate of 2.32%, the total population of people living with disabilities, compared to the total population of the country, it's obvious. So let's look at the livelihood context of young persons now. In Nigeria particularly, you have about 440 million that are estimated to be living in Nigeria by 2050. And this has implications for the job market because it does indicate that its complex nature and its multifaceted nature will experience more unemployment and underemployment, as the year progresses. Particularly for youth between 18 and 25, who, when they finish what we refer to as the secondary school, and in other places you may call them high school, such children or young people take on to some form of work, and you find them around farms or even home enterprises like home care jobs and construction. Even within the age of 30 to 35, you find youth in the urban area, for example, who have taken on, some of them, long-term or short-term jobs, but mostly around informal retail work, home enterprises, manufacturing, construction, or even professional, where their educational level is higher or their training is a little bit higher. Now, within the context of this livelihood that we have just mentioned, you find people with disabilities struggling to be manifest, to grasp a means of living, while contending with other youth that do not live with disabilities. And so in their own case, the challenges that they face show that they are at risk more, especially during this pandemic, when it has to do with the fact that their disabilities, either sensory, physical, or cognitive or psychosocial difficulty inclined. And so the situation is indeed more profound now for them and their families, considering the heightened burden of care due to the absence of effective social protection floors in the country. So on that basis, I think I need to also explain a little bit about what determinants of the health inequalities mean in the context of this presentation. We're looking at health inequalities as the results of natural biological differences or free choices. And so they are, especially as explained by Graham, Marmot, and McCartney, systematic differences in the health of people occupying unequal positions in society. The social determinants we're looking at in this case related to health include issues like availability and access to housing facilities, education as a basic service, financial security or insecurity as the case may be, the built environment and all the spatial challenges that presents, and of course the health system and its adequacy to be able to meet the needs of young people with disabilities. In turn, these conditions can be shaped by other overriding factors that we're going to be mentioning, but let me just mention a few of them: politics, economics, and the related social policies, there. So for these young people living with disabilities to meet their livelihood needs, they are torn between the precarity for daily income and these social determinants amidst policy ineffectiveness for provision of social protection floor. Looking at psychosocial risk factors and health inequalities more specifically now, in terms of psychosocial, we are referring to the effects that stressful conditions could cause. And so status differences, control and autonomy of work, and neighborhood cohesion are examples of some of such effects that stressful conditions can impact on individuals or groups living with disabilities. Talking about the risk factors in this instance, we are looking at factors that are associated with ill health, disease, disability, or death. They do not operate actually in isolation. Some of them are, coexist or interact with one another to give the conditions that we're talking about, the prevailing conditions we're talking about here. So, for example, we'll be saying that maybe disease is responsible for disability, or disability is responsible for disease. Now, the combined effects of these risk factors and health inequalities during this pandemic actually portends more difficult terrain to navigate for young people living with disabilities in Nigeria. It brings in concerns for other layers of both uncertainty and complexity. And we can already see how disability exclusion might be exacerbated in this time of crisis, of course. Another concern is that although they might be used, young people living with disabilities might be perceived to be used to flexible and remote working conditions because of their conditions. But in the current times, adjusting to innovative, communication technology options now adopted for businesses in is critical, and might cause severe drawback in livelihoods and health, adjustment. So initially, the context they lived in, some of them do not have the relevant qualifications or the relevant exposure to certain technologies, internet, and so that now that's what they do to keep their livelihoods up, to keep up with livelihoods and so on, has to do with adjusting to, a new means of communication and interaction for businesses where everything is now Zoomed or Hangout or webinars and so on. It's more a challenge for young people living with disabilities. Now, in view of the risks and inequalities explained earlier, there's a need, therefore, for an inclusive reinvigoration of the private sector provision, where you find more of these young people living with disabilities. And then there's also the need for, the issues of seeing that physical infrastructure is reinvigorated to meet the needs of these young people living with disabilities. Looking at the aspects of markets that they access, for their livelihood issues and private businesses, there's the need to reinvigorate this and bring in the needs and concerns of young people living with disabilities in the context of the pandemic and the drawbacks that come with it. For instance, also, you find instances where governments have provided access to credits. A lot of questions still is, there's still a lot of questions around how accessible is the support, the palliatives that government is providing to support young people living with disabilities in their businesses and their daily means of livelihood. So in concluding, I have looked at, in my presentation, these three key bullet points, but amidst the impact of the pandemic, therefore, I think it's important that there could also be an opportunity to reassess some of the entrenched systems that consistently exclude and constrain the young people living with disabilities in Nigeria. This especially is the ineffectiveness of inclusive social protection flows, where these do not exist, or where they exist, but if they are inadequate or inadequately managed. There's also the need to expose the invisible and unexplored impacts of the pandemic on this social group. I'll pause at this point, and then if there are questions, please reach out to me, and then we can be able to discuss more on this. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you. Good afternoon.
Kene, thank you for your presentation. Here are the references on the slide.
Yeah.
Hi. All right, Monique, are you ready for your presentation?
Wonderful. Yes, I'm just getting it up now.
Excellent.
So, is that up?
Yes.
Wonderful. So my talk today is about concerns that COVID-19 will worsen the physical and mental health disparities faced by autistic individuals. So a bit of an introduction. I'm going to focus on how COVID-19 might both directly and indirectly widen these health inequalities for autistic people, and especially autistic LGBTQ people. And a focus on how socio-ecological circumstances like structural inequality, minority stress, and victimization might play a role in this. So a bit about me and why I'm talking about this. I'm a disabled, queer, autistic academic. I have a particular interest in minority-majority group relations, identity, and disability. So that's why I chose to focus on this, alongside the fact that both autistic and LGBTQ people face health inequalities. Autistic people are also more likely to have a minority sexuality, like being lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or a minority gender, including being trans and gender non-conforming. And also, COVID may put a strain on a system that is already unequal for both these groups and at the intersection of these groups. A bit about the background. In the autistic community, there's a really high rate of co-occurring mental health conditions, such as anxiety, depression, and trauma disorders. Some estimates put it as high as 70% of the autistic community having at least one mental health condition. Similarly, there's a high rate of suicidal ideation, which is basically the contemplation of ending your life. Alongside this, there's a high early mortality rate, where autistic people die on average 2 decades before their non-autistic counterparts. But there's also a pattern of stress exposure that's undue. So for example, there's a high rate of unemployment and underemployment. A third of autistic people don't have access to work or the benefit system. There's a high rate of autism in the homeless population in Wales, and a further study showed that in England. And also 1 in 5 autistic people have been stopped by the police for looking suspicious. So you can see a structural inequality in the experience of autistic people there. In terms of inequalities in accessing healthcare, autistic people don't feel like they have equal access. 74% of autistic people and their families thought that autistic people receive worse healthcare, and this is without COVID in the mix. And 88% feel that doctors don't understand autism or the conditions that come with it. Compounding minority stress and status. So, sorry. Did I skip a slide there? Yeah, sorry. So in terms of interpersonal violence, autistic people are more likely to be victimized, including being sexually assaulted, facing domestic violence, both in terms of children, being children and receiving domestic violence from parents, but also from partners. This includes being more likely to experience financial, sexual, verbal, and physical violence. In all of those areas, they're 2 to 2.7 times more likely to experience them. When we think about the intersection of that, autism and LGBT+, I think it's important to take into account that trans people, for example, and LGBT+ people are more likely to experience victimization as both children and adults as well. And minority stress may be additive and compounding, right? So autistic LGBT+ people might be more likely to experience all of these. In terms of where we're at so far with COVID, the actual COVID guidelines show the structural ableism and inequality of access to healthcare. So guidelines for critical care, originally published in March 20th, centered around fragility. And they had a cutoff score of 5, where people who received a score of 5, where they were dependent on other people, may not have access to critical care. And if we have a look at what that means, right? So on the scale that they were using, a fragility score of 5 is mildly frail. These people often have more evident slowing and need help in higher order, what are activities of everyday living, like finances, transportation, heavy housework, or managing medications. It took 5 days to amend this guideline because autism charities and charities that work with people with intellectual disability pointed out that under these guidelines, autistic people, whether young or old, may not receive equal access to critical care solely on the basis that they need help or support from people around them. It took 5 days for the guidelines to be changed and for them to say that perhaps they should not use a fragility score in order to assess access to critical care of autistic people, and that perhaps it was kind of an example of structural ableism, where we assume that the worth of a person who needs more support is less than someone who doesn't. This extends even further in a more dark way. There have been increased cases of people applying do not resuscitate orders to community care homes of autistic people without consultation in an illegal manner. This has happened in multiple areas in the United Kingdom rather than it just being a one-off. Similarly, between the 10th of April and 15th of May this year, in total, 386 people with a learning disability, some of whom may be autistic because they haven't recorded it necessarily accurately, who are receiving care services, have died from COVID, which is a 134% increase from last year. 184 of those were in community services rather than what we would term residential care. So it's not only that people in residential care are not experiencing protected services, but also those who need community services are being exposed to COVID in a way that they should not be. The true number is still unknown because the data has not been released for the full period so far, even though it is a concern that more autistic people are dying. So COVID-19 and this particular pattern of stress exposure, there are some very real concerns that I have and that are starting to come to the surface. One, there may be an increased exposure to violence, especially during lockdown. There's a high rate of exposure to abuse and neglect, as well as domestic violence in interpersonal relationships. While lockdown was happening, there is a concern that these patterns will have been exacerbated and that there are no services to really help autistic people and autistic LGBT people leave these scenarios. Also, that there will be unequal access to healthcare, including less favourable treatment because of being autistic and having a learning disability. We've already seen this in a couple ways where autistic people don't have equal access to healthcare before COVID, let alone when the healthcare system has an increased stress, right? And when people are making decisions about who gets access to critical care, it should be made in an equitable way. However, currently it is not, and people who are disabled are worried that they won't have access to treatment. There's also a concern that there is an impression following stress related to COVID, which would be expected given that people are losing their jobs, facing economic precarity, and also if there is a death of a loved one. People with autism and autistic people already have worse mental health to begin with, so there's concerns that that's just going to get increasingly worse. Similarly, verbal abuse, if they struggle to wear a mask due to disability, there have already been some cases of people receiving verbal abuse for not wearing a mask in public outside, and there are some issues around this. And importantly, loss of services, including mental health care, when everything came to a close when we went into lockdown. So in terms of anecdotal concerns, I'm an advocate in this community. I work very closely with other autistic people. I'm autistic and queer myself. And these are the kind of feedback that I'm getting from everyone. There are concerns that autistic people will receive worse healthcare, and people are even saying things like, try not to tell anyone you're autistic, don't tell anyone, don't disclose. They'll only use it to make decisions about whether or not you get a ventilator, which is, it must be really, and is really stressful to walk around thinking that. Similarly, research is now showing that, yes, the mental health for autistic women and autistic men is either, the impact of COVID is either moderate or severe. So we see mental health getting worse as this happens. Autistic people describe either enjoying an increased accessibility because suddenly there is the ability to do things virtually, or they are feeling incredibly isolated, or sometimes both at once. Some autistic people might only have had a couple close contacts that they haven't been able to see in months. Autistic people are already more likely to experience loneliness, so this is a big concern. Similarly, autistic people are struggling with frequent rule changing and government advice regarding lockdown. Autistic people don't tend to like uncertainty, so the fact that this keeps changing kind of with very little warning, people are concerned that if they leave when they shouldn't leave the house, that they might encounter increased issues with police, for example, which, given that there's already a tendency of autistic people to be stopped for looking suspicious, that might increase. And also they express that they're facing an increase in economic precarity. People are already losing their jobs, and autistic people are more likely to be below the poverty line already, and COVID is just making that worse. To wrap up, there are already large differences in stress exposure and access to healthcare for autistic people, especially LGBT autistic people. And there are current changes to socio-ecological environments that might increase certain exposures and in the long run increase those health inequalities, especially in mental health. And autistic people are feeling forgotten and uncertain, and they're especially feeling like because of their autism they won't have equal access to healthcare, and these are all issues that really need to be addressed as soon as possible. And then it's just references. Wonderful.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you so much. And we're now going to our Myrle's presentation. Give me 1 second.
Slide 1. Hello, my name's Myrle Blaine and I'm a doctoral candidate of the University of Derby, UK. My contact details are m.blaine, that's B-L-A-I-N-E, numeral 1 at unimail.derby.ac.uk. Slide 2. Title: Racial Inequalities in the UK and Experiences of Some Persons with Sickle Cell Disorder, SCD. Sickle cell disorder, SCD, is a form of anemia, global genetic health condition affecting an estimate of 3 to 5 million people globally. Basically, in England, there is an estimate of 12 to 15,000 persons with sickle cell. Sickle Cell Society. It is the fastest growing genetic condition in the UK. Time 2017. This is significant because more funding, resources and screening may be required to save lives. By 2050, numbers will increase by 30% globally. Peel et al. In the UK, persons with SCD are disproportionately from Black, African, Caribbean or Asian descent, but not exclusively. It is prevalent in Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, India and South and Central America. Chakovity et al. Considerable numbers of complications occur, including pain, organ failure, strokes, blindness, kidney problems, and hearing loss. Hence, they are likely to be viewed disabled by the Equality Act. The past 50 years have seen individuals living longer, partly due to new drugs such as hydroxyurea and advances in patient care. Militing Cato. Some current treatments, bone marrow and stem cell transplantations, are not fully used nor extended to most persons, predominantly adults with SCD. Yet they may benefit American Society of Hematology. Barriers include inequalities, discrimination in education, employment, and health. For example, being twice as likely to die with COVID-19, Public Health England, and more than twice as likely to be unemployed than non-disabled. Scope. Intersectionality of race, unemployment, and disability compound with each other and shape their ability to obtain employment. Prejudice, 2018. For example, Williams et al. Found 81% of persons with SCD unemployed. Slide 3, title, a pilot study. A small pilot study in 2019 titled How Do Persons with Sickle Cell Disorder Experience, Understand and Explain Their Employment Experiences? A thematic analysis was carried out. The results found 14 themes. Examples of some of these, and quotes, are as follows. Theme, discrimination. Quote, there is nothing wrong with you, and I was supposed to get support to return to work. She was adamant that I shouldn't have it. Theme, prejudice. There was so much prejudice, and I think part of it was because I was black. ... The thing is, the prejudice was coming from my own people. Theme, disability, stroke illness. Quote, saying I was sick because she couldn't believe it until one day when the ambulance picked me up at ... because I had a major crisis. They said, we didn't know you got so bad ... but you have been telling us ... They were besides themselves. Theme, attitude. Quote, you are an able-bodied disabled. My argument is, I'm arguing inequalities stems from the structures in society. It's systemic, and we know it's institutional. SCD is seen as unprofitable, neglected, and slow progress in research funding, and treatments. Unlike some other genetic conditions, such as cystic fibrosis, which mainly affects white people and which affects the lungs generally. I am consciously aware that persons living with SCD experience inequalities. I'm insightful that COVID-19 has exacerbated black and disabled persons' truth of discrimination, inequalities, racism, etc. which prevails and continue to permeate most aspects of their lives. Now being even more cautious, and they're told they are likely to develop diabetes and high blood pressure and likely to die with COVID-19. Not surprisingly, they are working in areas such as the NHS, as doctors, nurses, cleaners and porters. They experience systemic and persistent inequalities in employment, health, housing and low-paid work. The police have already been found to be institutional racist, following the Macpherson's report inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence. And recently, in this time of COVID-19, there are discussions of structural inequalities, but that's already known in that community. And some persons living with SCD lived experiences. Slide 4. Thank you. My contact details are m.blaine, B-L-A-I-N-E, numeral 1, at unimail.derby.ac.uk. Any questions? Slide 5. References. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Monique, do you want to share? Sorry, Monique, Rumana, do you want to share?
Hello? I couldn't get rid of your screen, I'm sorry.
Sorry, how do I? My apologies, I'm trying to. Can you not share yourself?
My screen. Do you want me to share my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
Sorry.
now it's working. Okay.
Apologies.
Right. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm trying to make my screen available. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Thought I was doing. Sorry, give me a moment, please. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, it's popping up now. Excellent. Yes, we can see it.
Great.
Just,
okay. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. Oh, I started with the last one. Sorry about my inefficiency. Yeah, is it appearing right now?
excellent.
Excellent, okay. Thank you for letting me talk, and thank you everyone who are attending. I hope it will be making some sense as well, and will follow the leads of others. This is basically a test paper, not stemmed from a research as such. So basically, this is more of a theoretical paper. It's just some notes that I'm throwing. I put in a photograph just to cheer you up, rather than talking about only my disability and our discriminations. I want to say that that this is a picture from my little garden. That is the only little place that I was able to breathe in for 4 months before last week. So I wanted to share that view and also to share the feeling that nature is the only space where perhaps people with whatever disability and discriminations can breathe in a bit. So the overview of this talk, briefly, I just put very brief ones, that this contribution focuses on a comparative and intersectional feminist analysis, which argues that migrant women with specific disability and chronic condition do noticeably experience the pandemic differently than that of their counterparts. These counterparts includes migrant men, and of course, native men in any country, not only in the Britain, but also in Bangladesh, because I'm originally from Bangladesh, so I'm referring to Bangladesh. And non-migrant women, of course, who have similar chronic conditions, they also don't always see that the migrant women with specific disability might bear the burden a lot more. It addresses also how gender inequalities, sexism, and migration inequalities intersect with disability and health inequalities, and how it becomes more noticeable during COVID-19 in both the UK and Bangladesh. I just wanted to sort of like think about broad questions and a few arguments that have been popping up in my mind for the last several months. By taking a cross-cultural approach to gender and disability studies, I present some examples from Bangladesh and Britain, which will show how categorizations are done, arguing that disabled migrant women have been experiencing the lockdown and pandemic in two different societies in similar ways. Women and migrants who have specific disabilities have become subjected to additional health inequalities and responsibilities due to their social categorization, which ably women and native disabled men and women would not know. So to think through, I have found the theories of intersectionality very useful, but for theorizing these kind of unequal experiences and subjectivity of disabled migrant women in COVID-19 inequalities, I would draw on social theories by feminist sociologists and social psychologists such as Antias and Yuval Davis, 1992, and Bloch and Phoenix and Yuval Davis, who argue that social categories, social divisions are mutually constructed, and categorizations cannot be understood by reducing the analysis to additive aspect of social reproduction. This means that when I have a specific disability, my people from my own communities, and these include women as well, could be quite prejudiced and discriminating against me in certain contexts. So this is not an analysis between white and black or brown. This is a general analysis. So disability, I understand and I would define as a social category more than a health condition. And even though considering health is important, mutually constructed as in disability is mutually constructed as interwoven with other social categories. And I would define gender as a social categories, as everybody already know, mutually constructed as interwoven with class, race, ethnicity, and nationality, as well as disability. Migration and immigration status inform and intersect with all of those categories. And how we will be keeping well is a question of how we negotiate all of these categories, and our emotion and mental health will be dependent on that. So methodologically, I mean, how did I come across this discussion as relevant? This must be a question. So people often don't notice that I can have an issue. People say, oh, you are quite fine. But basically, I have a long-term condition in the which I have developed after coming in the UK. And in the climate of Britain, I find it very difficult to cope up. It is called RA. So when it flares up, I go totally immobile. And it has developed after a long struggle that I can't go in detail, but the slides are here, you can look into. So I share the household with someone who also has a specific disability, but I wouldn't say disability, it's rather a kind of dyslexia. But I find him quite privileged by their gender, race, and nationality. The messiness of NHS this time during the COVID-19 is what really provoked me to think about how badly migrant, disabled women have been treated. So I was left without medication for 6 weeks. It's incredible. I was totally immobile, shielding. I was in deep isolation, but without medication. And then there are other stories I cannot go into now, but I'm sure many of you already are aware of these disparities. The disparities against migrant women specifically is much worse, and I want to talk particularly about this, that migrant women already, others have already talked about this, migrant women who were subject to domestic violence in the UK have been treated very badly. Recently, I just want to go into detail in this one, that many of you might be aware that there was a DA bill, domestic abuse bill, that the UK Parliament has passed earlier this week on 6th of July. For this bill, we have, several migrants, women's rights, and BME women's rights organization is a coalition called Step Up Migrant Women, have produced a briefing paper to include the migrant women with expenses of domestic abuse to be considered for access to justice. So because around 60%, according to the Southern Black Sisters briefing report, around 60% of women who approach Southern Black Sisters, and one of the organizations that I run is called Community Women Against Abuse, is a Bangladeshi migrant women's organization. Around 60% of women who approach us for support have insecure immigration status. Women with no recourse to public fund are vulnerable to high rates of domestic and sexual violence, sexual and economic exploitation, domestic homicide, including so-called honor killing, and suicide are happening. I have been currently dealing with the case of an international student from Bangladesh who came here just before the lockdown in early March. She's very suicidal currently, mainly because first she was sexually abused by her partner, and because she's an international student who came here to do masters, she doesn't really know anybody else. She only knows her partner. So she contacted me because I'm a women's rights advocate. That's how she contacted me. Only after he forcefully wanted to marry her. So she needs a safe home. And then to have a safe home, she needs an income. And to have an income means that she needs a job. But in lockdown, especially for migrant women, this is just like impossible. And because she doesn't have any access to public funds, so she's totally left without protection. So basically, we have been, from the Community Women Against Abuse, we have been paying, I have been paying for her therapies because she has become so suicidal. And I don't earn enough to eat myself. My partner helps me to buy food. So this is the situation of migrant women. But what happened that even though Black and minority ethnic women suffer from disproportionately higher rates of these types of harms and deaths linked to a history of abuse, earlier this week on Monday, 6 July, when the parliamentaries were given the opportunity to vote to this bill that you see on the screen, that are given a very basic summary of the domestic abuse bill amendments that we have suggested. Only 3 quick amendments, which are the clauses 22 and new clause 26 and new clause 27. And where the MPs have not only been requested verbally or by conferences, but many women, both white, Black, brown, everybody, men, have written to the MPs in written letters to vote to these amendments, but they haven't voted. New clause 22 recalls to public funds for domestic abusers were totally rejected. And that's why you see the other picture on the screen where these other Black sisters and other community organizations of women with migrant backgrounds have been protesting. So I just wanted to elaborate on this because I feel totally, I don't know any right language to say that how badly you could be treated in a country that is known as developed country, that one group of women will have domestic abuse service and another group will not have. Because I'm running out of time, I have to cut down a lot, but I also briefly wanted to talk a little bit about what also happens in Bangladesh. It is not only in Britain that we say that these kind of things happen. In Bangladesh, you do not have such coalitions to work for to work on women's issues. Instead, women are seen totally like women are made invisible during the lockdown. One example, brutal example, could be that an 80-year-old mother of 4 adults who contacted coronavirus in late March was taken to the rainforest and left in the middle of nowhere by her own children and partner. This is the mother. And so this is just one example, but there is no mentionable research that I could give refer to. The true number of gender discrimination and violence, especially interpersonal violence in the homes during lockdown, are not known. So, but the situation for migrant women are very bad in Bangladesh as well. The Rohingya refugees have not been protected by the government at all. The Tripura indigenous women have been let drown. So this is not just the UK case. I just wanted to throw this as a provocation to you all, as you think, I think we all think in the same way. So just to think about disability in context of migration and gender both, because conceptualizing health inequalities and immobility of disabled migrant women are important. And I would like to conceptualize these kind of cases as gender disability and gender device in health and immobility more than anything else in pandemic, for recognizing the ways in which categorizations are done and how categories are used in times of pandemic. Reflecting on personal experiences are also useful. So, and then there are some references. I just wanted to thank you all for giving the opportunity to speak, and sorry about taking longer. If you want to contact me, please email me, and also you can find me on Twitter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all your presentations. And if all the panelists want to unmute themselves and come back on the screen. Thank you. Yes, I think these presentations really bring together, even though they're all very different presentations and different contexts and talk about different groups. I think one of the things that they really have in common is the relation between health and disability and how this plays out basically before the pandemic and specifically during and expected after the pandemic. And then also how this sort of intersects with other social categories and experiences and realities and inequalities like race, like sexuality and gender identity and migration status and youth or generation as well. So we have about 10 minutes for a few questions and some comments as well. So everyone who's attending, if you want to ask any questions to the panelists, then here at the bottom there is a Q&A box. And in this Q&A box you can ask your questions, and then we can pick your questions here and we will communicate this to the panelists. There were two comments here for Rumana. First, that your garden is beautiful. That is one of the attendants commenting that. There's one comment about sort of a comment that you made about dyslexia, and to emphasize that dyslexia is a disability and that it's important to sort of like mention that and yes, to sort of recognize that. So it's, yeah, so let's sort of pay attention to that as well. There is a question here from Monique. Thank you, Monique. All that you said resonates with me. My support network is pretty small, 2 people only. I've not seen one of them since March. I'm managing depression since December, and COVID is a big change. But I enjoy the accessibility of meetings for my work. I love not having to travel somewhere for a 2-hour meeting, but I also miss just being around people, although not necessarily interacting with them. So that's more well, a comment perhaps than a question. But there is something I think that quite some disabled people are noticing, that includes myself, that even though there are many inequalities, there are some advantages perhaps that we're noticing. Do you want to comment?
About, yeah.
Yes.
So there have been a lot of assumptions as well that autistic people might not miss interacting, because there's also an assumption that autistic people don't enjoy any form of social interaction, or that they don't kind of need it. So while autistic people are enjoying increased accessibility, I know myself suddenly, because at the moment I've been interviewing for jobs, and suddenly people not seeing my wheelchair, I'm surprisingly grateful for that, because I worry that it skews people's kind of biases. But also autistic people do want and have and like spending time with friends and social kind of situations. So I like to just remind people that, you know, autistic people are also being socially deprived at the moment. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Monique. Yeah. Catherine Dean has a question here, and it's a question that I'm actually really interested in. Well, and it is to all the panelists. So Catherine emphasizes that they started to call the UK government's response to this pandemic as an institutionalized eugenics by neglect. Do you agree with this characterization? And if you're not in the UK, then take whatever government you will. Who wants to? Rumana, go ahead.
I definitely agree, because of what I have said mostly was about UK. I'm not suggesting that I'm not having basic supports. Yes, those 6 weeks were hard, but that was also the start of the pandemic lockdown. But in general, the whole situation, I mean, it's not about disabled or able people, you know, people have been just not even having a safe home in a developed country. What do you mean? And like Monica just mentioned that about autistic people or with specific dyslexia, there is no service system, you know. My friends child who is a severe autistic child, is only 11 years old boy. He was he had a seizure for the third time in 4 months during this lockdown, just for the reason that Monique just pointed out, that now they do miss severe socialization problem because the schools are not safe for them, so he couldn't go back. So government is not thinking about, it's not about migrant women, nothing. But you might be asking, maybe this question is related to the comparative aspect that I wanted to point out, that yes, in Bangladesh, situation is not better, my friends. But my point is that you call Bangladesh as an underdeveloped country. You call them as a pragmatic, old days countries. You have colonized those countries. So why would you expect Bangladesh government to compete against UK government? They are just following what UK or Americas are doing, you know. So in Bangladesh, compared to UK, they are better in a sense that they have given at least camping and border facilities for 400,000 Rohingya refugees. Does it not matter to you? Of course, we have little food to share. So of course, when reliefs were given, where we have here like kitchen, soup kitchen, you know, and also like lovely food banks here, which you don't have in Bangladesh. That's purely because of the whole infrastructure. It needs a lot more work. But they are giving release, they are trying. But it's the women's situation in Bangladesh that is miserable.
Thanks. Any of the others? Monique, yeah, so but the question whether had the response of the government to the pandemic is institutionalized eugenics by neglect. Monique?
Yes, I feel exceptionally strongly about this, especially the blanket do not resuscitate orders that are being applied to groups of people who are either have learning disabilities or autism. They're not being put in place legally. They're not being put in place because there is anything about this group that might mean that critical care is less successful. It is just on the basis that autistic people are not seen to be worth as much by the government and non-autistic people. And psychological research has shown that non-autistic people tend to dehumanize autistic people. And I think that that is a process that is happening here. And by putting kind of blanket agreements across homes and saying that they won't send or might be less likely to send an ambulance out for specific groups, that is what we would kind of call definitely eugenics by neglect. And I think we really need them to release more official data on how COVID is impacting disabled groups and especially learning disabilities and autism, because we have seen an increased death rate. And that was back in between April and May, and they haven't released any data since. And I'm exceptionally concerned about it.
Thank you. Myrle and Kene, do you want to sort of respond to this question about whether you feel the government or governments, how they respond to the pandemic, whether perhaps we can call this institutionalized eugenics by neglect?
Yeah, thank you. The concern in this part of the world, first of all, is that the social algorithm, if you permit me to use that phrase, to tackle emerging concerns or emerging issues around COVID-19 is absolutely absent. And what is obvious and which becomes very clear to citizens is that the intermittent lockdown and unlocking of the society is an evidence of a confused policy trajectory or process by the government, especially also as only recently have there emerged some sort of sectoral strategic direction for revamping certain crucial sectors like agriculture, in order to be able to ensure that food security and health security are actually kept flying. Again, citizens are looking at and seeing that the institutionalization of the process of mitigation or attending to the process or the issues around the pandemic have been sort of conceptualized as another way of government wanting to be able to surrender to saying we do not have the resources to fight COVID-19, and so you have to bear with us. Again, on the other side of the coin of that same of the same argument is that the resources that are available, how well have they been used to be able to revamp facilities such as health facilities, which are completely comatose and require that unless something drastic is done, more citizens will be will be affected and would actually not be able to come out of the pandemic alive. So I totally agree with that. But then the difference is that the UK, for example, is better prepared in a way, not necessarily that they have had the experience of COVID-19, but the health system and infrastructure in place keeps them or makes them better prepared than is the case for a place like Nigeria and other similar contexts.
Thank you, Kene. Myrle, is there something, or do you want to respond to this question as well?
Well, I'll just add to partly what the last gentleman mentioned about resources. I think here in the UK, mainly, they are thinking about managing resources and who probably, the best people to actually have the resources. And that's not me agreeing with that. It's me observing what the situation's been. And the second thing is seeing disabled people, persons with disabilities, as second class, which isn't a new phenomenon really. So, the afterthought really as to how to support disabled people, people with disabilities, is the other thing. And seen as unimportant.
Thank you. Yeah. There is one comment here, Rumana, about someone preferring, rather than developed and underdeveloped, preferring the term low resource settings, like in Wales and deprived areas in the UK. We're going to wrap this up. I wanted to briefly comment, I think, on when I heard you, I've also been thinking a lot about eugenics and neglect. And then listening to your presentations, I also thought, or maybe we also have to think about prioritization of resources and experiences and needs and lives, really. And is it a neglect, or maybe we have to flip it around and think perhaps also about who has advantage and who has access and who gets access by the government to all these resources, and think in terms of privilege and race privilege and neurotypical privilege and able-bodied privilege and gender, perhaps age privilege as well. And that choices are made and perhaps to not only see it as neglect, but also as choices that are being made, right? And hierarchies that are increased. I think it's 5:05 right now, and we will continue this specific conversation about inequalities, intersectional inequalities in the 5th week in 2 weeks' time. And for now, I wanted to thank everyone for their really interesting presentation. Kene, Monique, Myrle, and Rumana, thank you so much. And Sarah, who's somewhere at the back, I can't see you right now, over there, who is at the background, who's been inputting all the transcripts. Thank you so much, everyone who's been attending. Thank you so much. If you want to ask the panelists any questions, please do get in touch with them. I think everyone is really happy to sort of continue this conversation. And thank you everyone for presenting and attending, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you for organizing.
I would just add that we have another one next week, and the question of statistics was brought up, so we actually have the Office for National Statistics and other presenters next week, so do look in again next week too, as well as the continuing discussion about intersectionality in week 5.
Excellent. Hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.